The air at the Henderson Farm auction that spring of '76 was thick with the sweet smell of money and diesel fuel. It was a heady perfume, the kind that made a man feel like a king just for breathing it in. Corn was over $3 a bushel, beans were pushing $7, and the Russians were buying every kernel we could grow. The bank down in town was handing out money like it was gospel tracts on a Sunday morning. "Get big or get out" was the sermon from the University Extension office, and boys, the congregation was listening. I watched from the back, leaning against the rusty fender of my old Ford pickup, the one with the primer grey door from a parts truck. My name's Frank Miller. I wasn't there to buy big. I was there to watch, to listen, and maybe, just maybe, pick up a piece of forgotten iron that nobody else wanted. My farm, the 320 acres my grandfather broke with a team of mules, was paid for. My equipment, a collection of John Deeres and Farmals from the 50s and 60s, was mine, free and clear. In 1976, that made me a peculiar sort of creature. A fossil, some said. The main event was a brand new International Harvester 1466, a real beast of a tractor. It had a cab, air conditioning, a turbo that whistled like a far-off freight train, and paint so red it hurt your eyes to look at it in the sun. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Slim, was working the crowd into a frenzy. That's when Dale Peterson made his move. Dale was 10 years younger than me, all confidence and white teeth. He'd taken over his dad's operation a few years back and had been expanding so fast you'd think the county line was a finish line he was trying to cross. He stepped forward, his new cowboy boots kicking up dust, and threw his hand in the air. His bid silenced the crowd. It was a number that could have bought a nice house in town with enough left over for a Cadillac. Slim's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. "Sold to Mr. Dale Peterson." A wave of applause went through the crowd. Dale stood there, soaking it in, a grin plastered on his face. He caught my eye from across the yard and sauntered over, the way a rooster struts through a henhouse. "See that, Frank?" he said, loud enough for others to hear. "That's how you farm in the modern age. Power, efficiency. You got to spend money to make money." I just nodded. "She's a fine-looking machine, Dale." He laughed, a sharp barking sound. "Fine-looking? Frank, that tractor will do more work in a day than your whole fleet of museum pieces can do in a week. When are you going to wake up and join the 20th century? The bank's begging to give us money. Land prices are only going one way. Up." He gestured with his chin toward the back row where the real junk was lined up. Tucked behind a set of worn-out disc harrows was an old Alice Chalmers Gleaner F combine. It was from the late 60s maybe. The orange paint was faded to a chalky pink, streaked with rust where the rain had run down its panels for years. A family of birds had made a nest in the engine compartment. To most men there, it was scrap metal waiting for a cutting torch. "See, you're eyeing the relics again," Dale scoffed. "You gonna buy that thing and part it out for beer money?" "Might," I said, keeping my voice even, still some good steel on her. "Good steel?" He shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face. "Frank, you're a good man, but you're gonna get plowed under. You can't compete with guys like me running iron like that." He jerked a thumb toward the gleaming 1466. "While you're trying to patch together junk from the boneyard. It's a new game now. Debt is a tool, leverage. You ought to learn how to use it." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was supposed to seem friendly, but felt more like he was checking to see if I was solid. Then he walked off to sign the papers that would chain him to the bank for the next 10 years. I waited. The crowd thinned out after the big-ticket items were gone. When Slim finally got to the back row, most folks were already heading for their trucks. He pointed a lazy finger at the old Gleaner. "All right, boys, what am I bid for this classic piece of agricultural history? Let's start it at $500. Who'll give me 5? Silence. The only sound was the wind whistling through the empty grain auger. 400? 3? Come on, boys, the tires alone are worth something." More silence. Slim was about to move on. I raised a single finger. "I got $100 from Frank Miller. $100 bill. Now who'll give me 150? 125? Nobody moved. Slim sighed, knowing he wasn't going to get another dime. "Sold to Frank Miller for $100. A few of the old-timers who were left shook their heads as I walked up to pay. I could hear one of them mutter to his friend, "Poor Frank. Got his daddy's sense but not his ambition. Could be king of the county, but he's happy being the prince of the scrapyard." I paid my $100 in cash, got the bill of sale, and made arrangements to have the old machine hauled back to my place. It was a gamble, sure, but it was my gamble, paid for with my money. Dale had his gamble too. The only difference was he was playing with the bank's chips, and the house always sets the odds. Now, before we get into what I did with that $100 pile of rust, and what happened when the music finally stopped in the Corn Belt, I've got to ask you folks listening. Have you ever known a man like Dale, all flash and credit, convinced he had the world by the tail? Or have you known a man like me, a fellow who'd rather own a rusty wrench than owe on a new one? Let me know down in the comments which man you think had the right idea, because the years that followed would prove one of us dead wrong. Getting that old Gleaner F back to my farm was a chore in itself. It took 2 new tires, a lot of penetrating oil on the wheel hubs, and a slow, careful tow with my John Deere 4020, the steadiest tractor I ever owned. We crept down the county road at 5 miles an hour, a sad, faded orange parade of one. People drove by and stared. I imagined the talk down at the coffee shop the next morning. Saw Frank Miller dragging home another piece of junk. Guess he's starting his own museum. I didn't care. I backed it into the corner of my machine shed, the one my dad and I built with telephone poles and corrugated steel back in '58. It wasn't a fancy heated shop like the one Dale was building, but it was mine. It had a concrete floor, a big cast-iron wood stove for the winter, and every tool I owned hanging in its proper place on the wall. The air inside always smelled the same, a mix of old oil, damp earth, and the faint, sharp scent of the arc welder in the corner. For the next 2 winters, that Gleaner became my project. My wife, Sarah, called it the Orange Monster. She was a good woman, a city girl who'd learned to love the land, but she didn't always understand my obsession with fixing things that other men threw away. "Frank," she'd say, bringing me a hot mug of coffee on a cold January night, "is it worth it? All this time and money you're putting into that thing?" "It's worth it, Sarah," I'd tell her, wiping grease from my hands with an old rag. "It's about knowing what you've got. Every nut, every bolt. When you buy something new, you're just renting it from the dealer and the bank. You don't really know it. When you build it yourself, it's yours. Down to the steel." The first thing I did was pull the engine, a big Alice Chalmers 6-cylinder gas motor. The bird's nest came out first, a messy tangle of twigs and feathers. Then I hooked up the chain hoist and wrestled the greasy block out of its cradle. I tore it down completely on the workbench, laying out every piston, rod, and bearing in neat rows on a sheet of clean plywood. The cylinder walls were scored and the rings were shot. I spent a week with a hone, carefully bringing the cylinders back to a clean surface, checking my work with a micrometer until it was perfect to the 1,000th of an inch. I ordered a rebuild kit from a supplier back in Illinois. New pistons, rings, gaskets, the works. It cost me a couple $100, more than I paid for the whole machine, but it was an investment. While I waited for the parts, I turned my attention to the guts of the combine. I crawled inside the threshing cylinder, a cramped, dark space that smelled of mouse droppings and rust. I checked every one of the cylinder bars, tightening the loose ones and marking the bent ones for replacement. I fabricated 2 new bars myself out of hardened steel, drilling the holes on my old drill press and grinding the edges to match the originals. The belts were all dry rotted and cracked. I spent a whole afternoon writing down the part numbers, then drove the 60 miles to the Alice Chalmers dealer in the next county. The kid behind the parts counter, no older than 20, gave me a smirk when I handed him the list. "Gleaner F," he said, like I'd asked for a part for a steam engine. "Grandpa had one of those. We might have some of this stuff in the back, collecting dust." He came back an hour later, blowing dust off a stack of old, stiff belts. He charged me full price, of course. As I was paying, Dale Peterson walked in. He was there to pick up a new set of jewels for his 1466. He saw me at the counter with my pile of old belts and just shook his head, a little smile playing on his lips. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The look on his face said it all. "Still playing with toys, Frank?" The work was slow and hard. I replaced the main auger bearings, patched a dozen rust holes in the grain tank with my welder, laying careful beads that I ground down smooth. I rewired the whole machine, tracing the brittle old wires and replacing them with new heavy-gauge copper, soldering every connection and sealing it with heat-shrink tubing. I rebuilt the carburetor on my kitchen table one night, annoying Sarah with the smell of carb cleaner, but she knew better than to argue when I got that focused look in my eye. All the while, the world outside my shop was going crazy. Dale was the talk of the township. He'd bought another 80 acres that bordered my land to the south, paying a price per acre that made my jaw drop. He was farming nearly 1,000 acres now. His new red tractors were always running, tearing up and down the roads. You could hear the whine of their turbos from a mile away. It was a sound of power, of progress. My sound was different. It was the steady, low thrum of my old 4020's diesel engine, a sound I knew as well as my own heartbeat. It was the clank of a wrench on steel in my shop, the hiss of the cutting torch, the hum of the welder. The men at the co-op started calling me Junkyard Frank. I'd walk in for a bag of seed corn and the conversation would stop for a second. They weren't mean about it, not really. It was more like they felt sorry for me. I was the guy who was getting left behind, the fool who was polishing brass on a sinking ship while they were all booking passage on a new ocean liner. One evening in the spring of '78, right in the middle of planting, I felt it. A lurch and a groan from the back end of the 4020. Then a sickening grinding noise. I knew that sound, a final drive. The bull gear had probably shed some teeth. It was a catastrophic failure, the kind that would put a tractor in the dealer's shop for 2 weeks and cost a fortune to fix. I didn't have 2 weeks. The rain was coming, and I had 100 acres of corn left to get in the ground. I limped the tractor back to the shed, the rear wheel wobbling like a drunk. My heart sank. This was it. This was the moment Dale and all the others were waiting for, the moment when my old iron would finally betray me for good. Sarah saw the look on my face when I came into the house, covered in gear oil. "What is it, Frank?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. "Final drive's gone on the 4020, I said, sinking into a kitchen chair, right in the middle of planting. She put a hand on my shoulder. "You'll fix it. You always do." Her faith in me was a light in the dark. I ate a quick supper and went back out to the shop. I worked all night under the harsh glare of a single bare bulb. I drained the heavy hydraulic oil, a smelly, thick river of it. I used the chain hoist and a dozen blocks of wood to support the tractor, then began the long, greasy process of pulling the rear axle. It was heavy, miserable work. Every bolt was tight from 40 years of rust and torque. My knuckles were bloody by midnight. But I had a secret weapon. Tucked away in the back of the shed, under a dusty canvas tarp, was a John Deere 4010 I'd bought for $300 at a farm sale years ago. Its engine was blown, but the rear end was identical to my 4020. I had bought it for exactly this moment. I was my own parts department. By sunrise, I had the axle and final drive housing off the parts tractor. By noon, after a few hours of sleep and a pot of black coffee, I had it swapped onto the 4020. My back screamed, my arms felt like lead, but as I filled the transmission with fresh Highguard fluid and fired up the engine, it moved. It worked. I was back in the field planting corn by 2 o'clock that afternoon, less than 24 hours after the breakdown. As I worked, I saw Dale's new IH pull out of his lane. He was heading to town. I found out later his air conditioning had gone out. He'd lost a whole day of planting, waiting for the dealer to come and fix it. He'd sat in his climate-controlled cab, helpless, while I'd been wrestling with a ton of greasy steel and winning. I didn't feel smug. I just felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. I knew my iron, and it knew me. The last few years of the 1970s felt like a gold rush. The price of corn and beans stayed high, and the value of land went through the roof. It seemed like you couldn't lose. Farmers were borrowing against their skyrocketing land equity to buy more land and bigger equipment. It was a spiral staircase to heaven, and everyone was climbing it. Dale Peterson was leading the charge. He was farming close to 2,000 acres by 1979. He'd traded in his 1466 for a massive four-wheel-drive Steiger Panther, a green monster that could pull a 12-bottom plow and made my 4020 look like a garden tractor. He built a new house on a hill overlooking his land, a big brick ranch style with white columns out front. He was featured in an article in the State Farming magazine, hailed as a farmer of the future. The article had a picture of him and his family standing in front of his new Steiger. He was grinning, looking like he'd conquered the world. The article quoted him extensively. "You can't be afraid of debt," he said. "It's the most powerful tool a modern farmer has. You have to leverage your assets to grow. The small, old-fashioned farmer is a thing of the past. In 10 years, operations like mine will be the only ones left." I read the article sitting at my kitchen table and folded it up neatly. Sarah saw me reading it. "Does it bother you, Frank?" she asked. "What they say? That we're old-fashioned?" I shook my head. "Nope. Let him have the newspaper. I'm happy with the farm ledger." And our ledger looked good. We were making money, more than we ever had before. The high commodity prices were good for everyone, debt-free or not. But our approach was different. While Dale was pouring every dollar of profit, and a lot of borrowed dollars besides, into more acres and bigger iron, I was doing the opposite. I used the profits from 77 and 78 to pay off the last of the mortgage on the original homestead. The day I drove to the bank and handed the teller that final payment was one of the proudest of my life. I walked out of that bank feeling 10 feet tall. I owned my land, all of it. The bank didn't have a single claim on a square inch of Miller soil. Instead of buying new equipment, I bought more old equipment. I went to auctions and bought worn-out plows, broken-down cultivators, and rusty grain wagons for scrap prices. I'd haul them home and spend the winters rebuilding them, reinforcing the frames, replacing the bearings, giving them a fresh coat of paint. My machine shed was starting to look like a dealer's lot from 1965, but every single piece was paid for and in perfect working order. I even finished the Gleaner F combine. After 2 years of work, I fired up the rebuilt engine. It coughed to life in a cloud of blue smoke, then settled into a steady, rumbling idle. I'd given it a new coat of Alice Chalmers orange paint. It looked almost new. That fall, I harvested all 160 acres of my soybeans with it. It ran like a top. The gulf between me and Dale was a topic of conversation down at the elevator. We were two different species of farmer, living side by side. One day we were both there, waiting in line to unload our corn. I was in my old Ford, and he was in a brand new GMC High Sierra, the kind with plush seats and power everything. He rolled down his electric window as I walked by. "Frank," he said, his voice dripping with a kind of patronizing friendliness, "I've been thinking. You're working yourself to death on that small patch of ground. You're not getting any younger. I'll make you a serious offer. I'll buy you out. All 320 acres. I'll pay you top dollar, more than it's worth. You and Sarah could move to Florida, buy a boat, never have to turn a wrench again." I stopped and leaned against the door of his fancy truck. I could smell the new leather interior. "That's a generous offer, Dale," I said calmly, "but I'm not selling." He looked genuinely confused. "Why not?" "You could be a millionaire, cash in hand." "A few reasons," I said. "First, my granddad's sweat is in that soil, my dad's too, and so is mine. You can't put a price on that. Second, I like turning a wrench. It keeps my hands busy and my mind clear. And third," I paused, looking him right in the eye, "I like sleeping at night. And I sleep real good, Dale, because I don't owe anybody a single red cent." A flash of anger crossed his face. My words had hit a nerve. "You're a fool, Frank, a sentimental old fool. You're sitting on a winning lottery ticket and you're too scared to cash it in. When this is all over, I'll own this whole county, and you'll still be here, tinkering with your junk." He rolled up his window and stared straight ahead, dismissing me. I walked back to my truck. I wasn't angry. I just felt a deep sense of unease. It felt like we were all in a car, speeding down a highway faster and faster, and Dale had his foot pressed to the floor while I was looking for the off-ramp. That winter, the winter of 79, the first signs of trouble appeared. They were small things, easy to ignore if you weren't looking for them. The price of diesel fuel at the co-op went up 5 cents, then 10. A bag of seed corn cost a few dollars more than the year before. The interest rate on my savings account at the bank ticked up 1/4 of a point. Little things. One night I was out in the shop, sharpening the blades on my sickle bar mower, listening to the radio. The news came on. A man I'd never heard of, Paul Volcker, the new head of the Federal Reserve, was talking. He used a lot of big words about monetary policy and fighting inflation. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood the gist. He was going to raise interest rates. He was going to make money expensive again. A cold chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. I shut off the grinder and stood there in the quiet of the shop, just listening to the hum of the radio. A few days later, a letter came from the bank. It was a form letter sent to all their customers. It was a friendly, cheerful notice about how they were adjusting their lending policies and a mention of something called a variable interest rate on new operating loans. To a man like Dale, with millions in loans tied to that rate, a letter like that was a declaration of war. To me, it was just a piece of paper. I tossed it into the wood stove and watched it curl into ash. Outside, the wind howled, a low, mournful sound across the frozen fields. It sounded like thunder, still a long way off, but getting closer with every gust. The spring of 1980 broke hot and early. The ground was already thirsty by the time I finished planting. The sky, a vast pale blue canvas, offered no promise of relief. By June, the corn leaves began to curl in on themselves during the heat of the day, a desperate attempt to conserve what little moisture they held. It was the beginning of a drought, the slow, silent kind that drains the life out of the land and the hope out of a man. The old-timers watched the brassy sun and the cloudless sky and started telling stories about the Dust Bowl. At the same time, the news on the radio turned grim. President Carter had embargoed grain sales to the Soviet Union because of their invasion of Afghanistan. It was meant to be a political statement, a shot across the bow of the Kremlin. But for us, out here in the heartland, it was a shot to the gut. The Russians had been our biggest customer. Overnight, the bottom fell out of the market. Corn that had been $3 a bushel was suddenly struggling to fetch $2. The price of everything we sold was collapsing, while the price of everything we bought, fuel, fertilizer, parts, kept climbing. The pressure began to show on the faces of the men down at the co-op. The easy confidence of the 70s was gone, replaced by a tight, worried look around the eyes. The loudest man in the room was now Dale Peterson. But his tone had changed. It wasn't the boastful crow of a king anymore, it was the nervous bluster of a man trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "It's a temporary dip," he'd say, leaning against a pallet of seed bags. "A market correction. The smart money is doubling down. Buy land now while the weak hands are getting scared." But his eyes didn't match his words. They were bloodshot and darted around nervously. He was losing weight, and the skin on his face was stretched taut over his cheekbones. The strain of carrying that much debt in a falling market was eating him alive. The first real crack in his empire appeared in the middle of that blistering July. I was cultivating my soybeans, riding my old Farmall H, a tractor so simple you could practically fix it with a hammer and a pair of pliers. I saw a cloud of dust down the road and watched as Dale's giant green Steiger Panther limped into his own laneway, trailing a dark slick of oil on the white gravel. A few hours later, the dealer's service truck rolled in. It sat there for 3 days. I found out what happened a week later from one of the mechanics at the dealership when I went to pick up a new set of points for my pickup. The planetary gear set in one of the Steiger's final drives had self-destructed. It had chewed itself to pieces, sending metal shavings all through the axle housing. The mechanic whistled as he told me about it. "Never seen one grenade like that," he said, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "It's a $20,000 repair minimum, and we had to order the parts from the factory in Fargo. Dale's down for at least another week. He was not happy." A week of downtime in July, with the weeds choking the beans and the second cutting of hay ready, was a disaster. $20,000 was more than I'd spent on all my equipment combined in the last 10 years. For Dale, it was just one more bill to add to the pile, one more draw on an operating loan that was already stretched to its limit. He had the biggest, most powerful tractor in the county, and it was sitting dead in his shed, a useless monument to progress, while I kept chugging along on my 50-year-old iron. That fall, the harvest was a grim affair. The drought had cut yields by a third, and the low prices meant that even a good crop wouldn't have turned a profit. I spent 2 weeks on my old Gleaner F combine, the $100 machine I'd brought back from the dead. It never broke down once. I filled my grain bins and shut the doors, determined to wait out the low prices. I could afford to wait. My bins were paid for, my harvest was mine. Dale had no such luxury. The bank wanted its money. He had to sell his grain right off the combine at rock-bottom prices just to make the interest payments. I'd see the big semi-trucks lined up at his place, hauling away his crop, hauling away his equity, hauling away his dream, 1 bushel at a time. The cracks were no longer hidden. They were starting to spiderweb across the entire foundation of his farm. The sermon had changed. It was no longer get big or get out, it was just get out. The winter of 1981 was when the thunder that had been rumbling in the distance finally broke overhead. Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve, in their war on inflation, cranked up the prime interest rate. It was a number that seemed impossible, a fiction. 12%, 15, 18. For a few terrifying weeks, it touched 21%. For me, it was just a number on the news. I had no operating loans, my land was paid for, my machinery was mine. The high interest rates were actually good for me in a small way. The pittance I had in a savings account at the bank was suddenly earning real interest. For Dale Peterson and a generation of farmers like him, it was a death sentence. His loans were on a variable rate. The friendly banker who had once urged him to borrow more to leverage his assets was now a cold-eyed stranger across a mahogany desk, sliding papers across that showed him the new math. An interest payment that had been $5,000 a month was now $15,000. The numbers were unsustainable. They were designed to break you. The farm crisis hit our community like a plague. The bulletin board at the co-op, once covered in notices for barn dances and tractor pulls, was now a wall of sorrows. Auction sale bills, printed on cheap colored paper, were tacked up one on top of the other. The Henderson farm, the Johnson farm, the Schmidt farm. Families who had worked the same land for 100 years were being wiped out. The headlines in the city papers talked about interest rates and monetary policy. Out here, we talked about our neighbors. Dale fought it for as long as he could. He sold off a 40-acre parcel, then an 80. But it was like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. The land prices, which everyone had assumed would only ever go up, were now in freefall. The very asset that was supposed to be his safety net was collapsing underneath him. He was selling his land for half of what he'd paid for it, and it still wasn't enough. One cold March morning, I saw the auctioneer's truck pull into his lane. A few days later, the sale bill went up at the co-op. It was printed on stark white paper. Complete dispersal farm auction, Dale Peterson, owner. The list of equipment was long and impressive. The Steiger Panther, the International 1466 that had started it all. A fleet of plows, discs and planters, all of it late model, all of it bought on credit. The day of the auction was grey and cold, with a raw wind that cut to the bone. The mood was the complete opposite of that day at the Henderson sale years before. There was no excitement, no heady smell of money and opportunity. The crowd was quiet, somber. The faces were the same, but the expressions were different. These weren't buyers looking for a deal, they were neighbors watching a funeral. Dale stood near the porch of his big brick house, the one with the white columns. He looked like a ghost. His wife stood beside him, her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale. He wasn't grinning or shaking hands. He was just watching, his eyes hollow, as the auctioneer began to sell off his life, piece by piece. The prices were brutal. The big machines, the symbols of his ambition, went for a fraction of their value. The buyers were mostly out-of-state dealers and vulture investors, men who smelled blood in the water. The Steiger that had cost him over $100,000 sold for $30,000. The gleaming red 1466, the one he'd been so proud of, fetched less than $10,000. It was a slaughter. I didn't bid on any of it. I had no need for it, and I felt no satisfaction in watching his downfall. It was a tragedy, plain and simple. He had believed the sermon, and the church had collapsed on top of him. Late in the afternoon, the auctioneer got to the last item on the list. The land. They were selling it in parcels. The crowd grew even quieter. This was the final act. They started with the 160 acres that bordered my property to the south. The bidding was slow, hesitant. No one wanted to be the one to take a neighbor's land. But the bank's representative was there, a man in a suit who looked out of place and uncomfortable, and he made it clear the land had to be sold. The bidding stalled at a number that was criminally low. The auctioneer tried to work the crowd, but there was no money, no confidence left in the room. He looked around, his gaze pleading, "Do I have another bid, gentlemen? This is good, black dirt. They aren't making any more of it." Silence. The wind whistled around the corner of the barn. Dale closed his eyes. I saw his wife turn her head away, unable to watch. In that moment, something moved in me. It wasn't pity, not exactly. It was a sense of duty, a sense of history. I thought of my grandfather and his father, and the simple belief that the land was more than just a commodity. It was a trust. I raised my hand. The auctioneer's head snapped in my direction, his eyes wide with surprise. "I have a bid from Frank Miller," he boomed, his voice full of renewed energy. My bid kicked off another round. An investor from Des Moines countered. I raised him. We went back and forth, the numbers climbing slowly. The crowd was watching me now, whispering. Junkyard Frank was bidding on land. It came down to the two of us. The man from the city, with his checkbook and his cold calculations, and me in my worn work coat and muddy boots. The price reached a level that made my stomach clench. It was nearly every dollar I had saved, the profits from all those good years, the money I'd carefully put away while others were spending. It was the biggest risk of my life. The investor shook his head and stepped back. The auctioneer pointed a trembling finger at me. "Sold to Frank Miller." A murmur went through the crowd. It wasn't applause. It was something quieter, more profound. A collective sigh of relief. One of their own had kept the land in the community. I didn't look at Dale. I just walked over to the clerk's table, my legs feeling unsteady, and wrote out the largest check of my life. I had just bet the farm to buy another one. A week later, after the papers were all signed at the courthouse, I drove over to Dale's place. Most of his equipment was gone. The big machine shed stood half empty, like a hollowed-out carcass. He was loading the last of his family's personal belongings into a U-Haul truck. He looked up as I pulled in, his face weary and guarded. He thought I was there to gloat or to tell him when he had to be off the property. I got out of my truck and walked over, holding a piece of paper in my hand. "Dale," I said. "Frank," he replied, his voice flat. "Come to survey your new kingdom?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "I came to make you a different kind of offer." I handed him the paper. It was a simple, one-page lease agreement I'd typed up on Sarah's old typewriter. It offered to rent him the 160 acres I'd just bought. The terms were simple, a standard crop share agreement, fair and honest. At the bottom, I had added another clause, an option to buy the land back from me at any time in the next 10 years, for the exact price I had paid for it, with no interest. He read it, then read it again. His hands were shaking. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a confusion and a dawning sense of disbelief that I will never forget. "Why?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "After everything, all the things I said. Why would you do this?" I looked out over the fields, the dark, rich soil that was now mine, but had been his. "Because nobody should lose their home," I said quietly, "and because this land deserves to be farmed by a Peterson. Your dad was a good man, Dale. He'd want you to have a chance to make things right." He just stood there, speechless, the paper fluttering in his hand. For the first time in all the years I'd known him, the arrogant, confident Dale Peterson was gone. In his place was just a man, humbled by circumstance, being offered a hand when he expected a fist. He finally just nodded, unable to speak, and I got back in my truck and drove away. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm economy slowly healed. Dale took my offer. He sold the big brick house and moved his family into the original old farmhouse his grandfather had built, the one he'd been using for storage. He bought a small used John Deere tractor and a few pieces of older equipment at auction sales. He farmed his 160 acres and I farmed my 320. We were neighbors. The talk at the co-op changed. No one called me Junkyard Frank anymore. They called me Frank. The men who had once scoffed at my old paid-for machinery now came to me for advice. They'd ask about rebuilding a transmission or how to set the timing on an old gas engine. My shop became a gathering place on winter afternoons, a library of practical knowledge that had been almost forgotten. I'd help them fabricate a broken part on the welder or find a rare bearing in one of my old parts catalogues. I never charged them a dime. The currency we were dealing in was respect, and we were all richer for it. Dale and I never became close friends, not in the way you'd go to a ball game together. But a different kind of bond grew between us. It was a bond of shared experience, forged in the crucible of that crisis. We'd meet at the fence line sometimes, him on his old John Deere, me on my 4020. We'd talk about the weather, the crops, the price of beans. We never spoke of the auction or the lease. We didn't have to. It was just there, an understood history between two men who had chosen different paths and had both, in our own ways, survived. 9 years later, on a bright fall day, Dale drove into my yard. He was older, his hair greying at the temples, but his eyes were clear. He walked up to me with a cashier's check in his hand. He'd had a few good years, been careful with his money, and had saved enough. He was exercising his option. He was buying his land back. We shook hands. It wasn't a business transaction. It was the closing of a chapter. "Thank you, Frank," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just save my farm. You saved me." "You did the work, Dale," I said. "You earned it back." My own son, Tom, eventually came back to farm with me after college. He had a head for business, but a heart for the land. I taught him everything I knew, not just how to plow a straight furrow, but how to read the sky, how to listen to an engine and know what it needed. Most importantly, I taught him the difference between price and value. One afternoon, years later, I was out in the shop with my grandson, Ben. He was about 10 years old, with grease on his cheek and a look of intense concentration on his face. I was showing him how to rebuild the carburetor from an old water pump. He held up the brass float, turning it over in his small hands. "Grandpa," he asked, "why do we always fix old stuff? Dad's friend just bought a brand new tractor. It's got a computer in it." I stopped what I was doing and looked at him. I saw the same curiosity in his eyes that I'd felt as a boy. I picked up a heavy, worn-out wrench from my workbench. The steel was dark with age and oil, the manufacturer's name almost worn smooth from a lifetime of use. "Ben," I said, handing him the wrench, "feel the weight of that. That's real steel. It's honest. Now, a new tractor is a fine thing, but it comes with a payment book, and that payment book is heavier than any piece of steel you'll ever lift. That book owns a piece of you. This wrench, you own it. There's a freedom in that that's worth more than all the computers in the world." I pointed to the old Gleaner combine, still parked in the corner of the shed, its orange paint faded but dignified. "That machine over there," I said, "it taught me the most important lesson I ever learned. It's not about how big you are or how fast you go. It's about how much you owe. At the end of the day, the man who sleeps soundest isn't the one with the most acres. It's the one who is master of the acres he has." Ben looked from the wrench to the combine, then up at me. He didn't understand all of it, not yet. But he would. The land would teach him. The iron would teach him. And I'd be there to help him listen. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields. The fields my grandfather broke, my father nurtured, and I had held on to. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth, a promise of another season, another planting, another harvest. It was a good life. It was enough.